Good morning, everyone. Hope everybody's having a great day today with all this heat we have here in Southern California. Hope everybody's keeping cool and hope your business is doing well. Today I wanted to talk about seller's license to remain in possession addendum when a seller makes the request or has a need to stay in the property after the close of escrow. The document I just highlighted is one form. The second form is a residential lease after sale, seller in possession after close. I'm going to kind of review each of these files, but in going through the files, keep in mind a couple of things. One, if the buyer has a loan, any possession after the close of escrow must be reviewed by and approved by the lender, the buyer's lender. I have seen situations where the buyer lender will approve of a 5-day or a 10-day or less time period. I've seen it with 30 days or less. I've seen it with 60 days or less. But whatever happens, the buyer and seller, we cannot as agents allow them to negotiate that type of situation outside of escrow. So it must be in escrow. All the documentation reflecting what the agreement is must be in escrow and uploaded into our SkySlope files for that transaction. So again, keep in mind, if your buyer or seller or both say, hey, that it's between us, what difference does it make? Anytime you come to an agreement like that, when it comes to the loan and the lender's requirements, then if you don't tell the lender, if you do it outside of escrow so the lender is not aware of it at the point where they fund and allow the escrow to record, that's lender fraud. And lender fraud can lead to loss of your license. It can lead to jail because it's a federal offense, it's a felony. So again, in doing a seller possession after the close of escrow, always get the approval from the lender, buyer's lender, and then move forward from there. The first form I want to talk about is the seller license to remain in possession addendum. That's the car form SIP. That is a one-page form, a one-page document. It's designed for 30 days or less after the close of escrow that the seller will remain in possession of the property. It must be completed in its detail, and it outlines just kind of in a loose form, not as much detail as the second form I'll be talking about, but it'll talk about the maintenance, it'll talk about the utilities, it'll talk about the everyday things that go on in a home with whoever's in possession, in this case the seller, who's responsible for it, who's going to pay for it. And what's going to happen if the buyer or if the seller doesn't maintain or doesn't uphold his end of the bargain, which I've seen. So again, you just have to be very careful in putting these together. I always recommend that there be a detailed accounting as to what is going to happen. The problem is, and I've seen it, and that's why I'm bringing it up today, is if a buyer and seller come to an agreement with the seller's possession after the close, the seller, what happens if they default and they remain in the property, or worse yet, they move out but a son or their daughter stays in the property? How do you deal with that? Well, I always recommend, if you're going to fill out this document, this car document, the car form SIP, always take the extra step. Put that seller on a rental agreement. That helps your buyer later evict whoever is in possession of that property easier, quicker. Without it, it can take forever. I have managed property management with my previous brokerage, and I know what a headache that can be. If you've got a person in there that is not supposed to be in there, and you go through the eviction process, it's a little bit costly, not overly so, but it's still costly, number one. And number two, it takes time. If you don't have a written agreement as to who has possession of that property and what's allowed and what's not allowed, then it can take 6 months, sometimes longer if the party fights it, to get that person out of there. And that could create all kinds of problems for your seller in terms of their legal responsibilities, or worse yet for the buyer, because they're the ones that want to move in and do whatever they're going to do with the property, but can't because they're in a battle trying to get the person in there out. So again, as much detail as you can put into this, do. So fill out that form. I'm not going to go through it term by term. You can read it and go through it. If you go through this SIP and it talks about, you have any questions about what it says or not, please get a hold of me. Get a hold of your broker, Steve Rowe up in Northern California, Jeff Green in Central California, Omar Hellman in the LA Orange County market, or Mary Jane Morris in the Temecula Marietta market. They can help you complete it. They can help answer any questions you might have regarding it. And I think it's well within your best interest, as well as your seller's or buyer's best interest, to have a complete answer and complete understanding as to what's taking place with that. The residential lease after sale. Now this particular document is actually 5 pages long. It's more detail, but it's for those possessions that will be where the seller will remain in possession 30 days or longer. The first document I covered is for 30 days or less. This is for longer than 30 days. It gets into much more detail. It gets into rent. It gets into the term, the date. So if the escrow closes on Monday, for example, the first day after on the close for a seller to stay in possession is the next day. It'd be Tuesday. So if a seller has 3 days after the close of escrow to move out, escrow closes on Monday, day 1 is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. That means they have to be out by 5 o'clock on Thursday, the end of the business day. Now, can that be changed to midnight? Yeah, everything can be changed. Everything is negotiable. But whatever is negotiated, make sure it's in writing, signed by both buyer and seller. Long-term seller in possessions. You have to be careful with this one, primarily because to be involved with this type of length in terms of staying in possession, you need to have a security deposit. You need to have a rent amount. You need to discuss late charges. You know, how are they going to be handled? Or NSF checks. How is that going to be handled? What kind of charges are going to be derived if that situation were to happen? Maintenance on the property. You know, who's going to pay for the watering of the grass or the plants or the flowers? Who's going to cover that? In some cases, you know, if there are problems inside the home, plumbing, electrical, whatever the case might be, is the seller going to, as long as they have possession, are they going to be taking responsibility for that? Or will the buyer, the owner of the property, take responsibility for that? You need to identify that, because the buyer, the new owner of the property, may bring in a licensed contractor to take care of whatever the problem or issue might be. Whereas the seller, who is now a tenant, might just kind of throw something together just to stop that leak that's going on underneath the kitchen sink or underneath the bathroom sink. It may not cure the problem. It might be a short-term fix, and might even exaggerate the problem. So you need to have an identity so that there is a clear-cut line as to who's responsible for what, and make sure that that line of communications is such that if the seller's remaining in possession, they'll contact the owner and say, hey, listen, I've got a leak, take care of it. What are the rules and regulations? Is it a condo? If it is, make sure that the seller, in possession has a copy of the rules and regulations so that they can abide by the rules. They already know them or should know them, but you want to make sure, because if they're not obeying the rules, the HOA is going to assess a fine, and the fine goes to the buyer owner of the property. Locks and keys, you want to make sure you identify how many keys the tenant seller has, and if there's a garage remote, make sure you identify those as well. You want to make sure you talk about subletting. Are you going to allow, as a buyer owner, the seller to move out and leave their son or daughter or friend or whoever is in there? Are you going to allow subletting or not? You know, again, that's not a good idea. I've seen disasters with that. So you want to make sure you identify it, talk about it, and make sure it's clear with everybody's mind, whether they agree to it or not, that it's in writing and signed off. Tenant's obligation in moving out. You know, again, when you go into a seller in possession after the close of escrow, you need to do that walkthrough. Even if it's only a 3-day in possession, that week before the closing, make sure your buyer understands the importance of doing that final walkthrough, the verification of property, and have them sign off on it. Because after 3 days, and take pictures, you know, of walls, so that if you see a potential problem, if they're going to move that big piece of furniture out, a couch, if they put a hole in the wall, you want to identify that so that the buyer can see, hey, this was before, no hole, now you moved out, there is a hole. So you want to have that identity. The seller or the buyer owner may not do anything with it, but at least it gives them options and it gives them proof. You want to protect your buyer. The second form gets into mediation, gets into agency, and all the normal form disclosures that you see in an RPA. So you want to make sure you have all of that. A topic that's coming up here in San Diego right now is rent control. If you are in an area where there potentially could be rent control, or I know up in LA you have rent control in pockets up there, you have to be really careful with how you handle that, because you are limited, the owner is limited as to what they can increase the rent. So if you put rent in, a rent amount in that's low for the area, then you're going to run into problems, because if the seller stays in the property in an adverse relationship with the owner buyer, then you want to make sure that that our buyer is being taken care of, so that number one, with the eviction, and number two, if the eviction gets dragged out and that owner tries to raise the rent, they're going to be limited by law as to what they can do. So again, keep in mind what the rent controls are, know what the rent controls are. So if this topic comes up, seller in possession after the close of escrow, you will be in a position to know exactly how to protect your buyer or seller. Again, if you have any questions, please contact your broker. Seller in possession, have a start date and an end date. Make sure you have to have that. You have to have an end date when that owner or seller needs to be moved out. Have a security deposit in all cases, even if it's 3 days, just have it held by escrow, released upon released when number one, the seller moves out, but also number two, to check for damages, to see if there are any damages like a hole in a wall or anything else that may have gone on. I've seen cases where cabinets have been removed out of the garage that were fixed to the wall. I have seen electrical outside lighting that's in the ground, under wiring being removed. I mean, a lot happens, so you just need to protect your client. Have a dollar amount attached to the contract, so that if rent is going to be paid during that short period of time that the seller is going to be in possession, and buyer and sellers agree, for example, for $100 a day. Have it so that, and that's for 3 days. Make sure on the 4th day it escalates to twice that. Sometimes in rent control you can't do that, but again, if you go to $200 a day, that gives the seller motivation to be out on the 3rd day. It's not going to drag out into the 4th or 5th day. Again, hold that deposit in escrow unless it's a long-term 30 to 60 day seller in possession. But just make sure that, again, you give motivation to that seller to be out on time, because if it's cheap rent, they can drag it out a few extra days and not be concerned about it. If their rent doubles on the day after the end of the contract, they'll be more motivated. Again, the start day is the day after the close. So if it closes on Monday, the day one begins on Tuesday. And then, make sure that you protect your client. Get everything in writing. Length of term, time of day, that gets to be an argument sometimes, and as well as who's responsible. Do a walkthrough prior to the close of escrow, take pictures, and then after the seller moves out, regardless of the term, make sure you do a walkthrough with, or have the buyer owner do a walkthrough with the tenant to make sure the home is in the same condition as that final walkthrough. My last thing, just real quick, required rejected offers in SkySlope. A lot of people have a question about where do I find it. So, you know, the form is self-explanatory. Just when you do pull it up, just read it, check the appropriate box and sign it. To find it, all you need to do is go into SkySlope, click on working documents, then click on office documents or forms, and you will find the rejected offers form there. Pull it up, complete it, sign it, put it into SkySlope. Your broker will approve it. That's what I have for today. I hope everybody's had a great day, and I look forward to, I know we have a picnic, a beach bash coming up on the end of August. I hope I can see all of you there. Hope some of you from LA can come down. Obviously Temecula, Marietta, even Northern California. If you guys up there would like to come down, we'd love to meet you and have a good time on the beach. Thank you for your time, and have a great rest of the week.